Hi all. So today we're going to enter the final full section of our textbook, and this is chapters 18 through 20, and this introduces the concept of the economics of labor markets. So over the following chapters, what we're going to explore is how, in a lot of ways, the market for jobs is just like any other market. The supply, in this case, is determined by the amount of people looking for a job or a particular type of job, while the demand, of course, is dependent upon the amount of producers in the market. So we're going to hop right into it by jumping into chapter 18, which reintroduces the concept of the markets for factors of production. Now, you might remember these for when we talked about the circular flow diagram from chapter 2. And in the circular flow diagram, what we introduced, or chapter 3, from the circular flow diagram, if you remember, what we introduced was the idea that there's two kinds of markets. There's a markets for goods and services, which is what we've talked about most of the time to this point. But there's also the market for the factors of production, which this is the market that producers purchase from in order to acquire the resources they need to create the products and the goods and services they then sell. So what are our factors of production? Well, they're land, labor, capital, and human capital, right? And so land, of course, is the physical space required to provide a service or good. Labor, of course, is the individual work and effort that human beings put into work. Capital, these are the physical items required to create goods and services. So these are things like computers, the office areas, machinery, etc. These are the things that go into the creation of the product, the materials used to create it. So, for example, capital for football would be the leather used to make it. And then finally, human capital. And human capital is a little different than labor. Labor is the actual effort exerted by human beings to create products. Human capital, however, that's the knowledge required to create those goods and create those items. So to give you an interesting example here, think about an ergonomic mouse. What an ergonomic mouse is, right, for your computer is it's a mouse which forms and contours to your hand and makes it easier to use a mouse for an extended period of time. The knowledge required to design something that works and flows with the human hand, that knowledge is human capital. The mouse itself is the actual capital, and it's created through some combination of labor and capital. So the factors of production are a form of derived demand. And basically what we mean by that is the demand for factors of production are based upon the decision to supply a good in a market. So to give you an example, the options and offerings of video games and the amount of video games in the marketplace and the amount of people wanting to buy video games gives us the derived demand for video game designers. So the fact that Microsoft decides that they're going to make Xbox games and they're going to make Xboxes means they have to turn around and hire video game designers and console designers and computer engineers. And so those jobs are dependent upon the decision of Microsoft to enter the game market and stay in the game market to begin with. So that's what we mean by derived demand. Now, we can think about this too in the context of what does this mean for competitive profit maximizing firms? Well, we're going to look at this basic assumption for labor markets and factors of production with the two simple assumptions we used when we introduced competitive firms. And that is that one, there's a lot of buyers and a lot of sellers, which means the market is competitive and that firms are interchangeable. And two, that all firms are interested in being profit maximizing. And that leads us to some simple enough examples here. So if we think about the market for apples, right? The decision of apple farmers to supply apples and the fact that apples are largely indifferent from one another. And the demand of apples then are ultimately determined, of course, the supply and demand for apples. And what we find is there's an equilibrium price where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded of apples balance out. Now, what's interesting about the market for apples, though, is while this all looks familiar, right? This is exactly like every other market we've seen. There's also a market for apple pickers. And the market for apple pickers is also a derived demand. And that is the demand for apple pickers, the demand for the labor of apple pickers, and the amount of people willing to work as apple pickers is largely tied to the price of apples and the demand for apples. And so the wage of apple pickers then is tied to the price of apples. Now, the production function is a way we measure the relationship of the quantity of inputs required to make a good and the quantity of output that they produce. So what we find is this production function allows us to measure also the marginal product of labor, and that is the slope of the production function gives us the increase in the amount of output from an additional unit of labor. And their overall trajectory of this production function and the fact that it will get flatter as higher amounts of input are added is a result of diminishing product. And diminishing product is the property whereby the marginal product of an input declines as the quantity of the input increases. So we can plot this in a table as we'll pop out here. We can plot this in a table as we'll see in table 1. And so what we find here is the production function shows us how much labor is increasing, or which is our input in this case, how increases in labor corresponds to increases in output. So note here that if we just look at these first two categories, labor and output, we see that if you have 0 workers, you get 0 bushels of apples. Well, that checks out, right? If no one's doing work, no one's making apples. But we also see here that if you add 1 laborer, you get an output of 100 bushels. What's cool here is that by seeing this change in the total output of we can then determine the marginal product of labor, which the marginal product of labor is then simply the change in the quantity of output, in this case from 0 bushels to 100 bushels, divided by the change in labor, in this case from 0 worker to 1 workers. So what we find here is that this first labor has an output of 100 bushels of apples, a total output of 100 bushels of apple, which means the marginal product of adding 1 worker is 100 bushels of apples. Now, the value of this marginal product of labor, you can determine this by simply looking at the overall value of the amount of the marginal product of labor times the price of the good. You can tell the price here is $10 because 1,000 equals 10 times 100. So the value of the marginal product of labor in this case is $1,000. So what this tells us is that by hiring 1 worker, they'll create 100 bushels of output. Their marginal product is 100 bushels then, which means the value they add to the firm by hiring this worker is $1,000. Now, notice here we're going to have a set wage for all the rest of our employees. That set wage is going to be $500 per worker. And so what we see here is that the value of the marginal product of labor is $1,000. Their wage is $500. Therefore, the marginal profit of hiring this worker is $500. That is, this first worker added $1,000 to the firm while only costing $500. Therefore, the firm's marginal profit is $500. Now, this should look really familiar, right? Because really all we're doing here is a marginal benefit, marginal cost analysis. In this case, what we're interested in is how much workers are adding value to the company and generating revenue versus how much it costs to hire them. So what we can see here is that if we hire a second laborer, our output will go up to 180 units. And what that means is by hiring the second worker, we've increased our total output by 80 units. So their marginal product is then 80. And again, you can calculate this by doing 180 minus 100, i.e. the change in quantity, divided by the change in labor, 2 minus 1. So you wind up with 80 divided by 1 equals 80. Now, for the value of the marginal product of labor, that then is 800 because we're doing 10 times the total marginal product of labor. So in this case, $10 times 80 equals $800. And their wage is only $500. So what we see here is by hiring a second worker, we have now increased the total profit of the firm by $300 because they added $800 in revenue and only cost us $500. And we can do this again for the third, the fourth, and fifth workers. And notice that the third worker, when we go through the process, we see that they add 60 additional bushels on top of our output. That means the value of their marginal product of labor is $600. Well, their wage is only $500, so we increase our profit further by having $100. However, notice that this marginal product we mentioned is kicking in. Each employee, we're increasing our total output by smaller and smaller amounts. So for our fourth worker, what's happening is they only increase our marginal product. Their marginal product is only 40 bushels of apples, meaning the value of their labor is $100 versus their wage, which is $500, meaning the marginal profit of their labor is negative $100. So know how the firm decides how much labor. The firm will hire labor as long as the firm, the new employee is adding more value to the firm, as long as the value of their marginal product of labor, this is greater than their cost, marginal cost, which in this case, wage. Since 600 is greater than 500, we know the firm will add 300 workers. However, we know the firm will add 3 workers. However, in order to hire the 4th worker, what we find here is that the value of the marginal product of labor goes from $400 versus their wage of $500. So in this example, what the firm will do is the firm will hire at 3 workers, and they won't hire the 4th and 5th worker, because hiring the 4th and 5th worker will actually lose the firm money. Now, beyond this table, we can also plot this out. The information we found in the table, we can plot this out as a production function. And the production function, now we can clearly see graphically what we've been talking about in basically, we can depict visually what we've been talking about in a table and what we've been talking about definitionally. So if you see here, you'll notice that the way the curve slants upward is it is increasing at a diminishing rate. So the decreasing slope we see is our diminishing product. However, the reason, again, this is the diminishing marginal product, is that you can also see that the value, the marginal product, and the value of the marginal product of labor is all decreasing. So the slope between any 2 given points is telling us sort of the the declining rate of the value marginal product of labor. And ultimately, again, as you can see here, we see just that diminishing rate. So that's what gives us the production function. And if you pay attention closely here, what you'll see is 100 apples for 1 worker, 180 apples for 2 workers. Yeah, this curve is just, again, a graphical depiction of what we saw in this table, right? So if we pop back to the previous table, we see, oh yeah, 1 worker equaled 100 output, 100 bushels was the marginal product of their labor. And similarly, we see that over here, where the value of the marginal product of labor is the slope in between each worker hired. Now, this actually has some useful implications because the value of the marginal product of labor ultimately ties into the demand for labor. So the value of the marginal product, again, is the marginal product of an input times the price of the output. This, for competitive profit maximizing firm, they hire workers up to the point at which the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage. As a result, the value of the marginal product curve is the labor demand curve for a competitive profit maximizing firm. Basically, wherever the market wage is for laborers, a firm will hire up to the point that the value of the marginal product of labor is greater than the wage. So graphically, we can depict this as simply this downward sloping demand curve, where the value of the marginal product is defining ultimately the wage or the benefits of the wage of these employees. So where the market wage then intersects with the value of the marginal product of labor, that gives us the profit maximizing quantity of apple pickers to hire. The labor demand curve, like any other demand curve, can shift, and there's a few things that do shift it. First off, the output price. If we have an increase in the price of a good, that increases the value of the marginal product of each worker and increases demand. So for example, if the price of an apple, we talked about a bushel of apples costs $10 in our earlier example. If it went up to $15, right, that doesn't change the fact that the first worker was picking 100 bushels of apples. It just means that the value of their marginal product of labor has gone from 10 times 100 bushels to $1,000 up to 15 times 100 bushels of apples, meaning that the value of the marginal product of labor of the dollars. And again, that's just an example where we increased the price of apples from $10 to $15. Another aspect, though, is technological change. And basically what we see here is that technological changes can increase labor productivity. And what that means is this would basically be a technology which allows laborers to pick even more bushels than they were otherwise. So let's say, pop back to our example of the apple bushels. If the first worker gets a labor augmenting technology, that means it's labor saving, and that means the worker, the value of their marginal product of labor goes up not because the price has changed, right? The price stays at $10, but because the quantity, all right, because the quantity, the marginal product of that employee has increased. So if a technology is introduced that allows the first worker to pick more apples, we might see his marginal product go up from 100 to say 120. And so that means they're still more valuable and their marginal productivity has gone up. A final aspect here, though, is the supply of other factors. And the reason why is because other factors of production affect the demand for labor. A great point here is physical capital. If physical capital is labor augmenting or labor replacing, then you ultimately need either negatively impacts the labor demand, again, in the case of physical capital's labor substituting, or if it helps employees and is labor augmenting, then an excess of physical capital might encourage more hiring of more employees. So just to give you an example, if you have a firm where you can replace people with an app that will make things more efficient, then in that case, you might just say, hey, well, we don't need as many employees. However, let's say that you're a trucking company and you have a ton of trucks. Well, you have the physical capital already, so why not hire more truck drivers to drive those trucks? Now, the supply of labor, it comes with its own set of issues. Noticeably, the supply of labor is somewhat determined by this trade-off between work and leisure, and that is driven by two effects, and that is the income and the substitution effect. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. But another aspect, though, is that what causes the labor supply curve to shift? Well, changes in taste cause it to shift. For example, who wants to work and who can work? So, for example, retirees don't want to work anymore, right? They've retired. So that takes them out of the labor supply. Similarly, the amount of people that want to do a job, that determines how the labor supply. So if there's a job that's particularly desirable, that means you're going to have a higher supply of labor. Similarly, if a job has demanding requirements in order to do the work, that's perhaps a better job than the one you currently have, and people in that job market are qualified to go to that other job, that's something that could influence it. So to give you an example, for finance, for academia particularly, right, for business and business academia, there's always options in the private sector. And so that's an alternative opportunity. And so the supply of business academics is also somewhat informed by the supply of opportunities in the business sector. And a final aspect here is simply immigration. If more people are moving into an area, then that's going to increase the labor supply as more people look for work. While if people are emigrating out of an area, leaving an area, that's going to decrease the labor supply. What this allows us to do then is when we combine labor supply and labor demand, it allows us to derive an equilibrium in the labor market. And what we find is the equilibrium in the labor market functions exactly like equilibrium in other markets. So there's two facts to know. The wage is the price in the labor market, and the wage adjusts to balance the supply and demand for labor. And as we discussed earlier, the wage has to equal the value of the marginal product of labor. Any event that changes the supply or demand for labor must change the equilibrium wage and the value of the marginal product. They have to be equal. And the reason they have to be equal is, again, that it is the profit maximizing point, and firms that operate below this will find that they're wasting money doing so. And the conclusion of this analysis, though, is we get something like Figure 4, which shows us that the labor market, again, resembles every other market we've talked about, with the unique factor that the price of labor is the wage and the quantity of labor is our x-axis. Now, what are the effects of shifts in labor demand and labor supply? Well, let's hear the effects of an increase in labor supply. Well, an increase in the labor supply shifts rightward, shifts the supply curve rightward, right, as we see here, and it leads to the exact same consequences we expect when supply increases in any other market. We have a decrease in the amount of wages, and we have increase in the amount of employment. To give you an example here, accountants are a fast-growing field and a huge field. So one of the things that current accountants are trying to do to continue to prop up their wages is the CPA exam, and increasingly making the CPA exam difficult. So that's a way to try to protect their wages due to the fact there is a large and increasing supply of accountants. Now, in contrast, let's consider a market where there's a huge boom. So, for example, technology and apps and social media. These firms have taken off, they've grown, they're much larger, right? Like Facebook and Twitter, Google, etc. These firms are now trying to hire more employees because they're larger scale. So their demand skyrockets and they shift right. And what ends up happening is for these firms experiencing these booms that need to hire more labor, well, they ultimately then have to offer higher wages. And these higher wages elicit more people to become computer scientists, computer engineers, and this explains why those markets have increased wages and leads to increased employment as well. But we need to consider the other factors of production we have, and those are things like land and capital. So the equilibrium in the market for land and capital is a little bit different, although still very similar to the equilibrium for markets. Capital, remember, this is the equipment and structures used to produce goods and services. Labor, land, and capital, though, they each earn the value of their marginal contribution to the production process. So the interesting thing here is just like labor, land, and capital are demanded based upon the value of their marginal product and their price. And this brings us to the linkages among the factors of production. In reality, factors abundant in supply have a low marginal product. And that's right because of our diminishing marginal product principle. And a lower price because they're abundant and have that lower marginal product. And a factor scarce in supply has a higher marginal product and a higher price. As a result, when the supply of a factor falls, its equilibrium price rises. To give you an example here, this is the reason why water is cheap while diamonds are expensive. It's just that promise of scarcity and that factor of scarcity. An event then that changes the supply of any factor of production can alter the earnings of all factors because factors are rarely isolated. They're used in conjunction with multiple other factors. So just to give you an example, if there's a labor boom, then that might mean the value of capital goes down if labor is capital replacing. Or it might mean the value of capital goes up because there's more labor to use said capital and be productive. Now, to close things here, I just want to give you an idea of what these markets look like. Notice that the market for land is slightly different than the market for labor. And the reason it's different is because the supply of land is much more inelastic. Now, you might go, why is the supply of land much more inelastic? Well, it's quite simple. Has the United States physically grown larger? Like the geographic mass physically grown larger in such a way that we can now build so much more than we had before? No, right? So the only way that land opens up is that when the price of rent incentivizes individuals to remove what's already there and put someone else in and reopen this land for other development. So this is one of the big fights in the battles over downtowns and large cities is the price of land changes so high, is this reopen supply, or do we leave it the way it is because it's already consumed? It's difficult to tear down buildings that are already there. And just a reminder, the rental price of land, well, this is basically interest rate. And similarly, the rental price of capital is also interest rate. And that's going to be because you have to take out loans typically for land and capital. But the nice thing about the market for capital is it functions basically the exact same as the labor market does. But again, the only difference here is that the rental price of capital or the interest rate is what determines the price in this market. So that concludes what we have for chapter 18. This was just, again, a refresher on our markets of the factors of production. And kind of nice, right? Like the tools we've talked about this entire time and built and developed and used in multiple ways in this class, well, they're the same tools we're using and need now to understand the employment market. All right, This is where we're going to leave today, and we're going to get into wages and earnings as well as inequality in our next few chapters. Take care, all. Have a good one.